Fire Captain Engineering, situation critical.
All available personnel on the double. Spock with me.
Long before lightsabers, before superhero universes took over multiplexes, before any of that, a low-budget television show about a starship and its crew quietly changed the world. Most people think they know everything about it. They don't. Behind the warp drives and the pointed ears is a story full of accidents, near disasters, and decisions that could have erased the entire franchise before it began. Here are 20 things about the original Star Trek that most fans have never heard. The man who almost wore the captain's uniform wasn't William Shatner. When the show was first being shopped to networks, the lead actor cast for the pilot was a different performer entirely, a serious, intense actor who had previously played one of cinema's most famous religious figures. He filmed the first pilot as the Enterprise's commanding officer, bringing a quiet, brooding intensity to the role. But after that pilot was shot, he decided television wasn't for him and walked away from the project entirely. That opened the door for a much more energetic, theatrical performer to take the captain's chair, and the entire tone of the show shifted overnight. Without that single decision, the character we know today might never have existed in anything like his familiar form. The most famous alien on the show was almost a completely different color. Early concept art for the science officer leaned into a much more menacing look, with deep reddish skin meant to evoke something otherworldly and unsettling. But there was a practical problem. In the mid-1960s, most American homes still had black and white television sets, and that particular shade of red would have rendered as a murky, almost sinister black on screen, sending exactly the wrong message to audiences. So the design team shifted to a subtler greenish tone, something alien enough to register, but gentle enough not to look like a villain on monochrome sets. Ironically, once color broadcast became standard, the tint was so subtle most viewers barely noticed it. It was really the ears that did all the work. One of the show's most iconic pieces of technology was never meant to be iconic at all. It was a budget fix. The original plan called for the crew to travel down to planets using a shuttlecraft, with full sequences of landing and departure. That would have looked spectacular, and it also would have cost far more than the production could afford. So the team came up with a cheaper alternative. A visual effect created by filming glittering particles against a dark backdrop and then playing the footage in reverse, paired with a distinctive sound effect. What began as a cost-saving shortcut became one of the most recognizable concepts in all of science fiction, inspiring decades of real scientific speculation about whether such technology could ever exist. The very first pilot episode submitted to the network was rejected outright. Executives called it too slow, too thoughtful, and not action-packed enough for general audiences. There was also discomfort among some executives about a female second-in-command character being shown in a position of clear authority. Rather than scrapping the entire concept, the network did something almost unheard of. They ordered a second pilot. The creative team went back to the drawing board, restructured the cast, sharpened the pacing, and built the show that audiences would eventually come to know. The original rejected pilot wasn't wasted, though footage from it was later woven into a two-part episode that went on to win one of science fiction's most prestigious awards. One of the show's stars almost quit after the first season, and a conversation with a civil rights icon changed everything. The actress playing the ship's communications officer had grown frustrated with her role and had decided to leave for a stage career, submitting her resignation. At an event shortly afterward, she was approached by a prominent civil rights leader who told her how much her presence on screen meant that for the first time, young viewers were seeing a black woman portrayed as a skilled professional working alongside equals on a starship bridge. She withdrew her resignation the very next day, later describing that conversation as one of the most important moments of her life. The actor who played the show's most famous alien character was, at first, deeply unsure about the role. He worried that the pointed ears and unusual features would make the character look monstrous rather than sympathetic, and that audiences might see him as a novelty rather than a real person. He also had to fight against his own instincts as a trained, expressive performer in order to portray someone who deliberately suppressed emotion. What changed his mind was audience reaction. Viewers didn't see a monster at all. They saw quiet depth, restraint, and warmth underneath the logic, and the character became one of the most beloved in television history. A kiss between two of the lead characters became one of the most talked about moments in television history, and the network fought hard to stop it from happening the way it did. Concerned about backlash from certain regions of the country, network executives insisted the scene be reframed, so the kiss appeared to be forced by outside influence rather than a genuine choice between the characters, giving stations an excuse to claim it wasn't real. But the two actors had other plans. During filming, they deliberately fumbled the alternate takes where their faces stayed apart, leaving the director with only the version where the characters turned toward one another naturally. The network got a version it could defend to novice affiliates, but audiences saw something far more meaningful. The show was nearly cancelled not once, but twice, and both times, it was saved by something almost unprecedented: organized fan action. After its first season, the network began signaling it might not continue. Viewers responded by writing letters, an enormous volume of them, flooding network offices over a sustained period. Petitions circulated. Fans gathered outside studio offices, and the pressure became impossible to ignore. The show was renewed. The same thing happened again after the second season, with another wave of organized response convincing the network to commit to one more year. It's considered one of the earliest large-scale examples of audience activism directly reversing a major broadcast decision. The large physical model of the starship used for filming had a secret hiding in plain sight. Its underside was never finished. Every camera angle used during production was shot from above or from the side, so the production team saw no reason to spend time or money detailing surfaces that would never appear on screen. The top and sides of the model were painstakingly detailed with panel lines, lighting, and paintwork, while the bottom remained rough and unpainted in places. Today, the restored model is preserved in a major aviation and space museum, and if you ever got underneath it, you'd be looking at the unfinished underbelly of one of the most famous fictional vehicles ever created. Here's something that surprises almost everyone. The most famous catchphrase associated with the show was never actually said on screen. The exact combination of words that became a cultural shorthand for teleportation simply doesn't appear in any episode of the original series, not once. What characters actually said were close variations, phrased slightly differently depending on the scene. This kind of cultural drift, where a misremembered line becomes more famous than anything that was actually said, happens more often than people realize across film and television history. In this case, though, the misquote became so deeply embedded in pop culture that it's now more recognizable than any line the show actually contains. Many of the alien costumes seen throughout the series weren't designed from scratch. They were pulled from existing studio costume warehouses and repurposed. Hollywood studios in that era maintained massive wardrobe archives built up over decades of film and television production, and the costume department for this show raided those archives constantly. Robes from historical dramas became ceremonial alien garments. Western-era clothing was repainted and restyled into something otherworldly. Old science fiction props from earlier films got new paint jobs and insignia. It was resourceful, creative recycling. And on a television screen, where the illusion only needs to hold for a few seconds, it worked beautifully. The standard handheld weapon carried by crew members throughout the series started life as something far less impressive, a basic toy ray gun pulled from the studio's prop inventory. Designers modified these existing pieces with new paint, added detailing, and reshaped components to make them look more advanced and futuristic. Up close, some of that toy-like quality remained, slightly off proportions, a plastic sheen under bright lighting, but on camera, with the right effects and sound design, they're read as serious, futuristic technology. Decades later, real-world research into directed energy weapons would be compared, more than once, to the kind of technology this prop was designed to represent. One of the show's most beloved comedic episodes, the one featuring small, furry, rapidly multiplying creatures that take over the ship, was actually a minor hazard behind the scenes. The props were built from synthetic fur stretched over foam, with small internal mechanisms in some of them to create a gentle vibrating purr. Under the intense heat of studio lighting, that synthetic fur built up significant static electricity. The creatures stuck to costumes, clung to furniture, and gave crew members small shocks when handled. With hundreds of these props needed for a single episode, the crew had to develop techniques for discharging them between takes just to keep filming moving. The show is also responsible for giving a name to one of the most enduring tropes in all of storytelling. In the series' color-coded uniform system, certain departments wore a particular color, and characters wearing that color, especially when they appeared as minor crew members on dangerous away missions, had a noticeably high chance of not making it back. The show never drew explicit attention to this pattern. It was something audiences absorbed gradually, episode after episode, until it became an unspoken visual code. Decades later, that color became permanent shorthand in storytelling discussions, used to describe any minor character whose only narrative purpose is to demonstrate that a situation is dangerous. Most people assume they know who the show's primary antagonist were, but the faction most associated with the franchise today wasn't actually the main rival in the original series. A different alien civilization appeared first, introduced in an episode widely regarded as one of the series' finest, and was positioned as the more central, more calculating adversary, a faction that felt like a reflection of one side of a real-world geopolitical standoff of the era. The more aggressive, warrior-coded faction that fans now associate most strongly with the franchise appeared later and felt like a reflection of a different kind of real-world tension. It wasn't until later films and a subsequent television series that this second faction became the dominant rival people now remember as central to the original show. The captain's defining heroic trait, trusting instinct over data, making the impossible call, wasn't an accident of writing. It was a deliberate, structural choice. Time and again, the ship's onboard computer would calculate probabilities, present grim statistical outcomes, and recommend caution or surrender. And time and again, the captain would override it and be proven right. This wasn't just a character quirk. It was the show making an argument, in 1966, about the relationship between human judgment and machine calculation, at a moment when computers were just beginning to enter everyday awareness. That same debate, how much we should trust algorithmic recommendations over human intuition, feels even more relevant now than it did then. Underneath all the space adventure, the show was quietly smuggling pointed social commentary past network censors. In an era where direct discussion of civil rights, war, or political division could get a show pulled or heavily edited, the writers learned to dress real-world arguments in alien costumes. One memorable episode featured a humanoid species locked in generations of hatred over which side of their faces was which color, a metaphor that left little to the imagination. Other episodes tackled corruption, war profiteering, and extremism, all through the safe distance of alien worlds and future centuries. Censors who might have cut a direct reference to current events were far less likely to object when the same idea was wrapped in science fiction. Not everything behind the scenes was serious. At one point, members of the cast were brought together to record a full holiday-themed album, and it leaned heavily into camp. One lead actor delivered a spoken, theatrical rendition of a classic lullaby that came across as equal parts sincere and unintentionally funny. Another cast member contributed a dramatic spoken-word piece performed with total seriousness. Other cast members joined in on cheerful seasonal songs with an enthusiasm that bordered on the surreal. The recording wasn't intended as a major release, more of a novelty promotional project, and it largely disappeared for years before resurfacing and eventually becoming a cult favorite among fans. The show's budget was, by any modern standard, almost laughably small. Sets were reused constantly, redressed slightly to represent different planets, space stations, and facilities. Crew members were often pressed into service as background extras. Visual effects that would cost enormous sums today, space battles, alien landscapes, planetary surfaces, were achieved through hand-built models, painted backdrops, and clever optical work done after filming. By the final season, budget cuts had become even more severe, and many episodes that called for ambitious visuals were instead scaled down to simple dialogue scenes in existing sets. And yet, even stripped down to almost nothing, the ideas and performances carried the show, which says something important about what actually made it work. And here's the final twist. During its original run, the show was not considered a success. Ratings were mediocre, the network was unenthusiastic, and it was cancelled after 3 seasons in a poor time slot. By the standards of the time, it had failed. But then something unusual happened. The show entered syndication, and reruns began airing on local stations across the country. A new generation discovered it in afternoon time slots, fell in love with it, and began organizing conventions and keeping the fanbase alive. That slow-burning rediscovery eventually led to feature films, multiple spin-off series, and a franchise that has now continued in some form for nearly 60 years, one of the most remarkable turnarounds in entertainment history, born from a show that was originally considered a failure. So there you have it. 20 things about a show that started as a low-budget experiment and ended up shaping how generations imagined the future. From the communicator inspiring real flip phones, to the medical scanner echoing in modern devices, the fingerprints of this show are everywhere, even in technology we now take for granted. It wasn't just a story about the future. In some small but real ways, it helped build it.